So a pleasure to be here uh, amongst all of you and with Venkat here. And over the next hour and a half, we are each talking about each other's books. I've been reading Venkat's book for the last few days with great interest. I have a bunch of questions for him. I'm going to pick his brains like there's no tomorrow. I warned you. And you can do the same to me as well. So, Venkat, now that I've had the first say, you want to ask me the first question?
Yes, thank you all for coming out today. It's wonderful to be here, and it's wonderful to be talking with you about your book, because I find language itself to be a very fascinating concept. And to have a book like this that talks about Indian languages and that delves into where they came from, I'm not sure such a book exists, or such a deep.
No, I stand on the shoulders of giants. Let me assure you.
Well, I want to get to how you've researched your book, but we'll get there. I'm very fascinated about how you've researched it. But I want to start with the idea of a country being a collection of languages. It's not a very old concept in India. I mean, India has never really been thought of as geographical areas of languages. I think that's more like in the last 100 years or 120 years or so. Because in the British times, India as an administrative area was subdivided into convenient administrative areas. So you had like central provinces in Berar just made sense to run under one administration. You had the Madras presidency, and there was no question of what is the language that is spoken here. It was just a mishmash. But all of that started to change about 100 years ago, if I'm not wrong.
Thinking definitely began to change.
So could you guide us through that shift that's happened as to India's now languages, collection of languages, as opposed to a collection of administrative areas?
Yeah, the idea of linguistic states, I mean, roughly about a little more than 100 years old, when the Congress party decided that if they had to communicate, when the Congress became a mass movement, communicating to the people in their language was a very important part of their political activity. And if you had to get people involved, you had to talk to them. You had to make them understand their political agenda. And you had to talk to them in their language. That was the only way they could communicate the message. So that being the case, the Congress then, they said, okay, the British have their own administrative system of provinces which are very arbitrary, but we are going to do it differently. We are going to create Congress organizations on a linguistic basis. So even though, say, a place like Karnataka, there was no Karnataka then, Kannada-speaking areas were dispersed, I think, in maybe 10, 15, maybe even 20 different territorial units. They said, this is a Kannada-speaking region, and therefore, we are going to constitute a Congress that will look at the entire Kannada-speaking region as a whole, and we will communicate to them in Kannada, and so on for other languages. And so the idea of the linguistic state goes back to that time when they actually began to think of.
So I find this fascinating because I've always had an interest in maps. I love looking at maps, whether they're road maps or maps that show you the mountains and the seas. And one of my favorite activities as a child in school was to color in the states of India. And you had to color in as part of your geography. And so the borders that we have grown up with and the borders that we see today within the country feel pretty sacrosanct. However, when you looked at 100 years ago, you had the British map, and the British map would separate it into administrative areas.
Units, yeah.
And it feels like an act of rebellion on the part of the Congress to say we're not going to follow these borders. We're going to reimagine the country according to language, because we are trying to go for independence and we need the support of the people. And so they've reimagined the entire map, and that is an act.
Yeah, I think it was a very, it was a big imaginative leap, to think on these lines. You're thinking politically and you're acting very locally, very pragmatically. So it was a very big imaginative leap. And then they actually actioned it. It couldn't have been easy. I'm using the reference of Karnataka because Karnataka was, the Kannada-speaking regions were subdivided into many territories. So they had to actually, communicate their message across territories to, Kannada-speaking people living in different territorial units. So it was a great act of imagination, great pragmatic leap, and it required a great amount of courage in a certain way to be able to do that, action it, handle the problems that would inevitably come with such kind of an action, and then just go forward with it.
And I think the first linguistic survey of India was only done about 10 years or 15 years before that, like the early 20th century.
Yeah, so the linguistic survey of India, which I think is perhaps what can I say? It's a great act of discovery, so to speak. It began in the 1890s, and the first published volumes began in about the early 1900s, and the project was completed in 1928. So the Linguistic Survey of India, which was overseen by George A. Grierson, it took a better part of about 40 years or so to, and that's where you actually got an answer to this question that European travelers and others had posed for a long time. How many languages are there in India? The linguistic survey came up with a number. You can contest that number. You can say it was not the correct number. You can problematize some of their conclusions, but you had a number. You got a number, and that number was actually astounding. I won't tell you the number. It's on the first page of my book.
I was about to say it.
Thank you. So it was an astounding number, and that's when you realized how complicated a linguistic region India actually was. And one of the things that Grierson said at that point in time was, I am saying, okay, this language is spoken here and that language is spoken there, but that border is very arbitrary. I can move the border 10, 20 kilometers more, and then I can move the border 10, 20 kilometers this way, and my answer will still be the same. So this linguistic border is a very arbitrary border, and languages flow into one another. They mix well, and you live amidst all of that. And India is a great example of that.
This feels like a good moment to talk about the difference between language and dialect. How does one language, or how does a speech move in here or move there?
So a Yiddish writer, Yiddish thinker, he said it beautifully. He said it in Yiddish, but I'll say it in English. A language is a dialect with an army and a navy. Right? So what is a language? What is a dialect? It's an arbitrary distinction. Right? What is a mountain? What is a hill? Is there a height differentiation where a hill becomes a mountain? There isn't actually. Some very high peaks are hills, and some very low peaks are mountains, right? So similarly, what is a dialect? What is a language? There is no clear distinction, right? So when you want to make something a dialect, then you have a standard. So this is the standard language. This is how the language is spoken. This is how the language is written. This is how the language is, these are the correct things about the language, spelling and grammar forms and so on. So you have the standard, then anything that doesn't conform to the standard becomes a dialect, right? But then why does this language get to be the standard? It's arbitrary, right? If you talk about Karnataka, Mysore Kannada is the standard language. So if you look at, say, Hubli Kannada or Bangalore Kannada, which are different, they are not. But why was Mysore Kannada chosen as the standard? Because Mysore was the center of political power, right? Wadaya, the king, sat in Mysore, and in the early 19th century, when printing came into the picture, and you needed to have a standard language, you needed to standardize spellings, right? You had to kind of choose. You had to make certain choices, and so you made these choices. So everything that was outside of that, then they are treated somewhat differently. So that's all there is to it.
This reminds me of England, where there are multiple ways of speaking English. And it's the BBC English that's...
The Queen's English.
That has become...
Now it's the King's English.
It's become like the standard accent-wise, pronunciation-wise, everything. And that's happened because the BBC had control of the airwaves.
Absolutely.
And therefore that became the standard. So there are like you say, there's an army and a navy, which could be a radio or a printing press as well, determines which language leapfrogs the others in terms of officialdom, in terms of becoming the standard bearer. And this shift that we've seen from like the 1890s or the 1900s, when the first real mapping of languages exercise began, to it becoming the sort of identity marker for you to start looking at how to classify the country, was pretty quick. Because in 27, the Congress started looking at a linguistic remapping of the nation.
Country, yeah.
And I think in 38 or something, they had it in their manifesto saying that when India becomes independent, we will do a linguistic reorganization of the country.
Yeah.
And that's in 40 years to move from how many languages are there to saying we are going to start relooking at the country as languages.
And that's where I have a question for you. We look at the map of India here today, the political map of India. There are all these states and union territories and so on, and it looks pretty even and ordered, right? It wasn't like that in 47, and I thought, you should perhaps tell us how incredibly messy it was in 1947, when this project of making linguistic states and so on began.
So like I said, the Congress manifesto said we want to do a linguistic reorganization, but the country itself was 60-40, where 60% of the country was under direct British administration. So you had the presidencies, the provinces, central provinces in Berar, Madras presidency, but then you had 40% of the country that was princely states. And they had a separate form of administration. So they had a more indirect system where the British still played an overbearing kind of role, but it wasn't direct in terms of line functions. So when independence came about, and independence came about very quickly, I think in June, there was still talk of, are we going to give you independence? And then suddenly it was in August, okay, you guys are August
on your own now.
Yeah, August is the deadline. So India had like 2 months from June 3rd till August 15th to really figure out what's going to happen, because partition was thrown into the mix. If partition hadn't been there, this would have been a lot smoother. But of course, by throwing in partition and by giving the 40% of India, the princely states, the option to choose which country you go to, India or Pakistan, or remain independent, the third option, I think that was just, it was a powder keg of a situation. So you had the Radcliffe line that was separating Pakistan and Bangladesh, today's Bangladesh. But then you had 40% of the country having to choose. And the presidencies and the provinces were handed over to the government of India saying, now you are in charge of. So the first order of the day was really to just bring the princely states back into the fold. And I think that's where Sardar Vallabhbhai Patel and his secretary of the States Ministry, VP Menon, who doesn't get the credit he should. VP Menon was phenomenal. He traveled the country in those 6 months or so around the end of mid-47, end of 47, just meeting every ruler of every kingdom, convincing them to sign up with India, standstill agreement, succession agreement, just got them all to sign on to India. And I think the effort that he's done there was fabulous. And so this mess of two administration systems started to come together as one in 47. And then the question of states took another 2 years. And the key date here is October 1949, which is when the Constitution of India was coming into effect was in January 50, but it was being finalized in October 49. And that was the document that put down the states by name. And so from 47 till 49, you had the States Ministry just traveling the country, figuring out how to bunch which areas together. The Chhattisgarhi kingdoms start to come together, but they will join up with Orissa. There was the whole Madras presidency is going to be this large. Mysore, the large kingdom of Mysore is going to remain by itself. So there were a lot of decisions that were being made almost on the fly. Gujarat was a mess. Gujarat was we had 565 princely states. Half of them were in Gujarat. So it was like this patchwork of states. So yeah,
So I'm sure some kingdoms were not not bigger than even Indranagar, I'm guessing. And you had a king.
Yes. Yeah. They were, the smallest one in Gujarat, I think, was the size of a neighborhood. And the worst thing was, kingdoms were split by another kingdom in between. So you had
an
Kingdom
enclave.
A, Kingdom B, then Kingdom A again. And it was just like, Nehru called it a patchwork of, a crazy patchwork of states. So yeah, those 2 years were all about just sort of cleaning all this up, bringing everybody in, saying ki we will figure out the final articulation of the states later. For now, let us take a first step. And I think that's the brilliance of the Constitution, is that it allows for states to be changed, the borders for states to be created, for states to be dissolved, amalgamated. All of that is possible. You can't leave the country, but you can change the borders of the states.
That's very interesting. Now, one thing I found very interesting when I read your book, which I didn't know earlier, that the first linguistic state was actually created before independence, you know. And
Can we ask the audience this question?
which state do you think it is? Tamil Nadu was Madras Presidency, which consisted of all the languages of South India. No,
We'll give you
before
a clue.
independence.
Yeah, it's in 1936.
No.
Yeah, we have an answer there. It's Orissa.
Odisha. Who said that? Okay. I think we should clap for him then. And I was wondering if you could talk about that. How did that happen? Odisha was separated from Bengal, wasn't it?
From Bihar.
From Bihar. Okay.
So we had, again, it was a British administrative clubbing together. It was called the Bihar and Odisha State, or something to that effect, agency, which is what they used at that point. And that was created in 1912. So Bihar is technically the first state to be created in India in 1912. And they still celebrate their Bihar Creation Day dating back to 1912. Then in 1936, based on the fact that Odia as a language was spoken in this cluster of regions, and again for administrative convenience, the British decided to put Odisha or Orissa at that time as a separate state, basis the fact that language was spoken there, Odia was spoken there, which is the first time they've done that. Again, the timing is very interesting. The fact that 27 pe Congress did this thing, 36 Odisha is created, 38 they put it in their manifesto. There just seems to be this wave of, language is going to be the new marker that takes us through. But then things changed after 47. Like the linguistic promise wasn't there anymore.
There was a great deal of nervousness. We'd been through a brutal partition. And then I think the Congress backtracked for a bit. They weren't sure whether linguistic states were the way to go, because they thought there will be more partitions. And and then it took the death of a person who figures incidentally in both our books to actually put things back on track again. When Potti Sriramalu died in 1953, after I think a 58-day fast, or where he continuously fasted for 58 days, and then he finally passed away. And that's when Nehru announced the creation of the first post-independence linguistic state, which was Andhra. And so he figures in both our books.
There is actually a memorial to Potti Sriramalu in Chennai. There is, I think, a building or a statue which commemorates him. And again, Chennai was a hotbed of that particular agitation. Like, so, going back to the 1951 census, when they did the census in terms of languages, Hindi and Punjabi were clubbed together, and it was the largest language by a long distance. But the second largest language was Telugu.
Telugu, yeah.
And Tamil was only fourth, I think, after Marathi. So Telugu, being the second largest language, didn't have its own state. And I find that very curious. I don't know if it's like a fallout of British policies, but that the northern half of Madras presidency was Telugu speaking and the southern half was
Tamil.
And Madras felt right
at the border.
And there was a real struggle over the city of Madras. It was just Telugu wanted it and Tamil wanted it, and eventually it went to Tamil Nadu. But Andhra has had a history of losing capital cities. It's lost about 3 or 4 now, I think.
So to compensate for that, they have 3 capitals now?
They had, until the court order stay came into place. But yeah, they were the first state to have 3 capitals in the country.
Which were?
there was Amravati, there was Kurnool, which was the capital for the second time, because Kurnool was the capital in
Originally.
53 as well.
Right.
And then there was Vishakhapatnam.
Visakhapatnam.
One was judiciary, one was the government functions within
I
executive.
think they've learnt a lesson. They won't lose a capital again
Yeah.
because now they have 3.
Yes. So this tussle over the city has happened in other places as well. I mean, you've had Chennai, but then you also had a tussle in Bombay between Gujarati and
Gujarat and
Marathi.
Maharashtra. Yeah.
We'll get to that because I want to look at the Hindi belt in general first. But I want to move up a little bit because we spoke about Odisha, and Odia was the first state to have its own linguistic requirement. But Odia is not the only language that's spoken in Odisha, and there's another language that goes across Bengal, Bihar, Odisha, and I think a little bit of Madhya Pradesh as well. Could you tell us about that?
So India's largest spoken tribal language is Santali. It's spoken by roughly 7.5 million people according to the previous 2011 census. And it's probably more spoken than languages like Konkani, Manipuri, all of which are state languages. But Santali doesn't have a state because the Santals are spread across, 4 or 5 states. And Santali was recognized much later. I think it was in 2003 that Santali was given official status. And the interesting thing that I found when I was reading Venkat's book was that if a certain state had been created based on popular demand, back in the day, maybe Santali would have got the prominence that it deserves much earlier. Jharkhand was created only in 2000, but I think Jharkhand has an old history of demanding Jharkhand, right?
Yeah, Jharkhand has an idea, or the first demand for an Adivasi state, which is today Jharkhand, was up in 1920. And the idea of Jharkhand, or the expression of Jharkhand has been around since independence, since the 30s, since 40s. And it's constantly, and this is so I always say that a state is created depending on circumstance. It depends on where your movement is, how popular it is, who's in power, who's in the state government, who's in the central government. All of that matters for a state to get the go-ahead and get officially recognized. And Jharkhand had this issue of always not Bihar, it always felt in the shadow of Bihar. And as a result, there was a constant struggle from the Adivasi community for representation, for their identity to be, and language was one of those markers. Santali was one of the identity markers for the Adivasi community. But you've had, I think there was a revivalist movement for Jharkhand in the late 80s or the early 90s. They had a lot of sort of non-violent rebellion movements saying, we'll take back tribal land, we'll take back forest policies we don't agree with. But the identity was really revived in the late 80s and the early 90s when you started getting this wave of what it means to be Jharkhandi. And that's also the time when this movement for Greater Jharkhand existed. So Jharkhand could be a lot larger than it is today. They would have had districts from Bengal, from Odisha, from Bihar, from Madhya Pradesh. And then you might have actually had this state language, Santali, as a really large part of East India. But Greater Jharkhand didn't happen. You just got Jharkhand.
It was only carved out from
Bihar.
Bihar,
Yeah.
right? And so actually, in a way, Santali lost out, even then, because since it was Bihar, so Hindi was continued. Though I think Santali has some status.
Santali is starting to see some grassroots movement. I think there's like radio channels and there's just this recurring pride now in Santali as a language, which I'm starting to see, which has happened again in the last 20 years or so.
Absolutely. I think the growth of the internet, the ability to disseminate information on the internet, and I think a certain amount of cultural insecurity, the fact that our languages are being overshadowed, say by English or by Hindi, has actually led to the resurgence of many languages which may have actually gone under if not for a concerted effort to kind of ensure that they survived and they continue to flourish. So Santali is one of those languages. Another interesting language that has seen a lot of cultural resurgence is a language from Tripura, which is spoken by roughly about say 1.5 million people, both in India and in Bangladesh, and it's called Kokborok. Right? And it's spoken by roughly 35% of Tripura's population and a fair bit of people in Bangladesh as well. And it always remained on the edges, on the fringes. It's a very ancient language. It's more than 1,000 years old. They have some very ancient literature as well. But from the 15th century onwards, when the kings of Tripura, they began to give priority to Bengali, Kokborok kind of became this marginalized language. And in the last 20, 30, 40 years, you've seen Kokborok kind of, come back into the consciousness. A BA program, MA programs have been started. There have been very concerted publishing efforts to publish books in Kokborok. And it's still published in 2 scripts. There is a Bengali script and there is a modified Roman script. So it's still published in 2 scripts. So there are things to sort out. Typically, it's good for a language to have 1 script, though it's not necessary. But it's a wonderful example of a language that's come back and made its presence felt. When, if we were having this conversation, say, 40 years ago, people would have said, oh, this language is going to die out by 2000 or something like that. But it's actually, revived itself wonderfully.
So I want to talk about a point that you just mentioned about the power that Bengali and Assamese, I would say, has in that region. I've traveled a little bit in that region, and there's a constant pushback from the locals about the fact that Bengali is so overbearing and Assamese is so ever present. And a lot of these languages were a pushback against that, this is the language of the region sort of thing. And again, it was an expression of the identity of each of those tribes. So Kokborok is one, but then you also have Manipuri or Nagamese, which I found fascinating. Could you tell us a little bit about each of those languages?
Okay, so Nagamese is a wonderful example of a language that's actually being formed as we speak. So Nagamese is a hybrid of the Naga languages, which are, I think there are about 26 or 27 Naga tribes who all speak very different languages. And so these Naga languages and largely Assamese, with a few Bengali words and a few Hindi and English words thrown in. So, so it's a very funny mix. It's a hybrid mix of languages from 2 distinct language families. So the Naga languages are all from the Sino-Tibetan family, whereas Assamese and Bangla, etc., they're all from the Indo-Aryan family. So these 2 languages have kind of come together, largely Assamese and the Naga languages. And so this new language, and that is actually the lingua franca of Nagaland. When the tribes speak to each other, they speak to each other in Nagamese. Because a person from one tribe cannot understand the language of another tribe. And, sorry? That's a common language. That's their common language. So Nagaland was a part of Assam till 1963. And so the older generation of Nagas who were educated when when they belonged to Assam, no Assamese. But after Nagaland became a separate state, the language that is most spoken in the Nagaland assembly is Nagamese. Because you have to make yourself understood. English is not understood by all. And so Nagamese, and so it is a language that has a history of roughly maybe less than 200 years. Now, if you go by recorded history, when the first British expeditions went there to Nagaland in the 1830s, they recorded the presence of a language that they called broken Assamese. The language didn't have a name at that point. So they called this language broken Assamese. When Grierson did his survey in the Naga Hills in the 1890s, he also observed that there were lots of Nagas spoke, broken Assamese again, imperfect Assamese he called it. And so yeah, that was clearly Nagamese, and it was in the process of being born. And then that process has just sped along since then.
So while everybody speaks Nagamese in Nagaland, they don't accept it as their official language.
So there was a government move in 2015 to make Nagamese an official language. They wanted to give it a status and so on. But the Naga intelligentsia protested. They said this is a bazaar language. This is a language without a history. and this cannot be the marker of Naga identity. The Nagas are a proud people, we are an ancient people, and a common language like this cannot be a marker of Naga identity. So they pushed back and they said, when we resolve it, we'll tell you what to do. Right now, the official language of Nagaland is English. It stays English. And I wanted to actually ask you, for the longest time, other than Mizoram and Tripura, right? The Northeast was basically Assam. And Assam underwent several partitions, if you could call that, or subdivisions would perhaps be the better term. And I just thought I could, quiz you on that. What happened there?
So Assam, the massive Assam that is today Northeast India, except for Mizoram and Tripura, was a British handover. They had the Assam administrative area that they just handed over to the Indian government. The problem was Assam itself had so many tribes. Like as you're saying, there's so many Naga tribes itself, but there are just so many tribes across all of the hills. And Northeast India is a combo of plains and hills. Assam is almost entirely plains, today's Assam. And all of the hill regions around it are the other states that we have today. And that was, this hills versus plains identity was one of the key factors of driving state creation in the Northeast India. It's something you'll see in Uttar Pradesh and Uttarakhand as well, the hills versus the plains. Now the issue was that the hills were not united. They had a hill tribe, a hill council to fight for independence from Assam, state creation from Assam. But these hills are each a tribe by themselves. And they have their own community, their own culture, their own language, everything. So while all the hills banded together to say we want separation from Assam, they weren't okay with only one separation. They wanted separation from Assam and separation from each other as well. Where they said Arunachal cannot be the same as Manipur, cannot be the same as Meghalaya. And so you started getting clusters of hills and therefore clusters of tribes and dialects or languages to start forming independent states. And the separation happened in different ways. You had slightly more aggressive, violent methods in certain states. And then you had states like Meghalaya where it was purely administrative. There was hardly anything apart from just saying, yeah, okay, the two of you are now Jaintia and Garo Hills, you are now Meghalaya. And Meghalaya's structure was interesting for the first year because Meghalaya was the first state to be created after Nagaland, to be created from Assam. And they created in the style of how USSR operated at the time. It was a state within a state. So Meghalaya existed independent, but also within Assam. So it shared functions. Like how the Soviet Republic, certain countries worked within the republic. And whoa, we shall wait.
It's a good sign. It's raining. We're back.
So Meghalaya was created in that way. And the great thing about state creation is that once the ball starts rolling, it's really hard to pull it back. So once you started getting concessions from the central government of saying, okay, we'll create a council for you guys, or we'll create, a separate administrative region for you, separate from Assam. You'll still be within Assam, but you'll have your own. And the thing is, these little concessions are really steps in the eventual state creation process. Even union territories, creation of union territories is a step in that eventual journey. And so you started getting these little concessions for each of these regions. And eventually they had to be created. So there was I think in the 80s, 87, there was, all of them became states. Arunachal and Manipur, and everybody became a state in 87. I think they just take it, let's get it done, let's move on.
And in 87 also Goa became a state. Yes. It had been a union territory for a very long time. One of the very interesting things that I learnt when I was reading his book was Goa actually had a referendum, back in 1967. And, just a few years after the Portuguese had been expelled from Goa. In 1967, there was a very interesting referendum question posed to the Goans. And I want Venkat to relate that story. It's a story that not too many people know about.
So yes, so the Portuguese were sent out in late 61. And in 63, I think in January 63, there was an opinion poll, what they call an opinion poll in Goa, to ask a very important question. The background to that is, after the Portuguese left, Goa was a union territory, centrally administered, what we call union territory. Now Goa, the Portuguese regions were Goa plus Daman and Diu, plus there was also Dadra and Nagar Haveli. So all of these regions, the neighboring states of Maharashtra and Karnataka felt that these regions should belong to our states, because Goa is really tiny. Dadra, Nagar Haveli and Daman and Diu are even tinier. And the interesting thing was, the assembly rules at that time for your state to have an assembly, legislative assembly, was you need to have 60 members. Goa was so small that they couldn't have 60 members. And therefore, Maharashtra just felt, you know what, Goa should be a district in Maharashtra. And a lot of the freedom fighters for Goa came from Maharashtra. The party that had been voted into power in Goa in 61, 62 was called the Maharashtra Gomantak Party. So, I mean, all directions, all arrows pointed to the fact that Goa should be a part of Maharashtra. Now, Kejriwal did this a few years ago, asking for an opinion poll from everybody, but this was done in 63 as well, where they had an opinion poll where people could come in and vote, saying, should Goa remain union territory, or should Goa become a part of Maharashtra, a district in Maharashtra? And they had symbols for it. It was a proper election. And the decision to stay a union territory was pretty close. I mean, they won, I think, 55-45.
It was really close.
It wasn't that far apart. Same with Daman and Diu, same with Dadra Nagar Haveli. And so Goa remained a union territory by itself. But it took a long time for it to then become a state. And I think part of that reason exists in the fact that Portuguese is really widely spoken in Goa. There is a very distinct culture and community that exists in Goa, separate from Maharashtra and Karnataka. And the fact that the language, apart from Portuguese, is Konkani.
Konkani, yeah.
Now, Konkani wasn't a scheduled language or an official language, and Konkani was spread across the coast.
Entire coast.
Yeah, it was very fractured. And how does Konkani now feature in the scheduled list?
No, so that's actually something that the Constitution also did very smartly. They said, so we have at the time, at 1950, there were only 14 scheduled languages. And they said, but that doesn't prevent a state from having its own official language, which need not be a part of the 14 scheduled languages. So, like for instance, Kokborok is not a scheduled language even now, but it is an official language in Tripura. So for a long time, Konkani could be an official language in Goa, even though it was not in the scheduled language list. And when Goa was made a state in 1987, Konkani was added to the list. So the Constitution allowed for these kinds of things, not just with states, you know, the amalgamation or division or changing of boundaries of states. They also made provisions for flexibility in languages. I think recognizing the diversity of India and future problems that no one had anticipated that would emerge. And that was how Konkani, you know, was in use for a long time, even though it was not a scheduled language till the late 80s.
Yeah, I think the Konkani movement, Goa became a state overnight, really speaking, because from 63 till the mid 80s, there was no real push for statehood. And then I think there was, in the assembly, there was a person who started this demand for statehood. And because I think the central government was just in the mood of creating states, because we already saw in 87, they created all of the northeastern states. And it was just the time was right, I guess, for Goa, where they said, yeah, okay, Goa should also be a state. And so they changed the assembly rules. Now, Goa's assembly has 40 people, 40 members as opposed to the 60 members. And Goa is still the smallest state in India. So I think that flexibility of accommodating different types of states exists, and it's constantly been in practice as well.
Right. And for a long time, there was this argument that Konkani is not a separate language, that it is a dialect of Marathi. And there were very serious scholarly efforts. There was much evidence that was found, some of it dating back more than 1,000 years, almost 800 years, where there were verses where the poets had said, this verse is for the Marathi milkmaid, and this verse is for the Konkani milkmaid. So there was back then a recognition of Konkani as a separate language, and that's how this argument was finally settled. That no, this is an independent language, this is not a dialect, and so therefore, they should exist, they should have independent identities.
So I want to ask you about scripts at this point. Does Konkani have a script that is separate from Marathi?
Konkani was written until late 80s in as many as 5 scripts. So it was written in Devanagari, it was written in Kannada, it's still written in Kannada script in Karnataka, it was written in Malayalam in Kerala, because there is a considerable Konkani population in Kerala. It was written in Roman, English script, largely by the Catholic Church. They had modified the English script for Konkani, and it still exists, the church still uses it. Apart from that, in Bhatkal in Karnataka, which has a large proportion of Muslims, they use the Perso-Arabic script for Konkani. So it was written in as many as 5 scripts. Today, Malayalam is no longer used. Kannada continues to be used in Karnataka. Perso-Arabic has also kind of fallen off the map. So Konkani is written in 3 scripts now. That is Roman, Devanagari and Kannada. But the Sahitya Academy awards works of literature in Konkani only written in the Devanagari script. So they are not considering works written in the Roman script or in the Kannada script, though it continues to be used. Because the church, the Catholic Church, had developed a very extensive, very interesting system of writing Konkani and reproducing Konkani sounds with the English script, with the Roman script. So they have not changed their script yet. And in Karnataka, for various practical reasons, Konkanis in Karnataka continue to use the Kannada script.
So if I take the example of Kodavatak, language of Kodagu, it's not in the book, but I'm not sure Kodavatak has a script, and yet it is recognized as a language and not a dialect of Kannada. And sitting in the south here, when we look at the northern languages, a lot of them feel very similar to each other. Even in the way they're written, the way they look when they're written. If I had to look at Marathi and Hindi, or Gujarati and Hindi, Punjabi and Hindi, there's a lot of similarity that exists between them. And so how important is the existence of a script for you to separate out a language and say you are separate and not a dialect?
Before I answer that question, so I would say this is the South striking back. Years of being called Madrasi, 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 and all the southern languages being amalgamated into one. So your question is striking back from the south. All the North Indian languages look like one. But
they also sound kind of in the same region.
Yeah, absolutely. They do. And Marathi and Hindi are written both in the Devanagari script, even though Marathi was written in another script also. So for a long time, Marathi had 2 scripts, Maudi and Devanagari. So Devanagari was used for literature. Maudi was used for documents and business and all of that. Because if you look at Maudi, you can write it very fast. You don't have to lift your pen from the paper. And so often, administrative requirements were for a lot of writing. So the scribes had to write very fast. So they used Maudi. And Devanagari was used for literature and so on. Punjabi was written in 3 scripts up until even after independence. It was written in the Gurmukhi script, it was written in Devanagari, and it was also written in the Perso-Arabic script, which is called Shahmukhi, which is still used in Pakistan. So scripts being the same, there is a tendency to see languages as the same, or similar anyway. And for a long time, and it's very interesting that you mentioned Punjabi, because Hindi was such an overarching word that many Punjabi poets were part of the Hindi pantheon. My father, who studied in Ujjain in Madhya Pradesh, he remembers reading Nanak's poetry as part of his Hindi syllabus. Right? But Nanak today is a Punjabi poet, Punjabi religious figure and so on. But for a long time, Nanak was part of the Hindi universe as well. So it was a lot more, the divisions were a lot less, clear. Then they were quite happy to include all kinds of people in all kinds of figures in that. So those are some of the interesting things. And at some point of time, the divisions become stronger, and some people are in and some people are out, and so on.
And this Punjabi versus Hindi was the basis of creation of Haryana, where the Gurmukhi script and Punjabi was a language of the Sikhs. And if you were Hindu, then you were, more often than not, you were a Hindi speaker. And
you were told you were a Hindi speaker.
You were told. So when the census was being conducted in terms of enumeration, then there was a major movement of saying you are Hindu, so put Hindi as your Devanagari as your first language. And there was a very clear geographical separation where you had Punjabi more towards the north, closer to the border, and you had Hindi more in the southeast. And so that separation was what eventually, then there was a long and bloody battle, but eventually you got Punjab and Haryana, and Punjab separate from the Hindi heartland, because Punjab itself was spread out
across
and interspersed with what is Himachal Pradesh today.
Absolutely.
And that whole northern, the neck of India, required a whole bunch of reorganization, which happened in the 60s. When Punjab was created from the Hindi heartland and Haryana was created, at the same time they also created Himachal Pradesh, Chandigarh. And Chandigarh was supposed to be a city, but then the Punjab-Haryana creation made it a union territory, which now houses 3 high courts. And it is, I've heard it's a fair administrative headache.
Nightmare.
Yeah.
Imagine the number of IAS officers and, with their beacons running around, three different kinds of IAS officers.
I do want to ask you about the Hindi belt. There's this large northern India section which includes Bihar and UP.
From Haryana right up to Jharkhand.
But it's not all Hindi. There is Hindustani, there's Urdu, there's Bhojpuri, there's Amrapali, there's a whole bunch of languages that happen there. But today they're all just sort of clubbed under Hindi.
Hindi, I mean, the Hindi, the growth of Hindi, I wouldn't say the birth of Hindi, the growth of Hindi as the name for a bunch of different languages, similar and yet different languages spoken all across North India, is a very interesting story. And depending on which side of the political divide you're from, what your religion is, you will have your opinion and you will have your own version of the story. One person who actually tried to kind of bring things together was Gandhi. And Gandhi proposed a solution, and that solution exists till today, though we don't actually see it as that. The Great War, apart from Bhojpuri and Braj and all of that, was Hindi versus Urdu. Hindi being the language of the Hindus and Urdu being the language of the Muslims. And that was the thinking. So what differentiated Hindi and Urdu, really? I mean, if you've seen a Pakistani TV serial or if you've heard a Pakistani leader talk, you can more or less understand him, right? I mean, maybe a few words you wouldn't. So Pakistani TV serials are popular in India. Indian Hindi films are popular in Pakistan. It wouldn't have been possible if they didn't understand the language. So therefore, what is Hindi, what is Urdu? So the scholarly opinion was Hindi has a high proportion of Sanskrit words, and Urdu has a high proportion of Perso-Arabic words. So Gandhi being Gandhi proposed a midpoint. We will have Hindustani, which is 50-50, which is a fair bit of Sanskrit words and fair bit of Persian and Arabic words as well. And he really tried to promote that. What is spoken, I think, largely in many parts in the north and in Pakistan is actually Hindustani. It's not Hindi, Shuddh Hindi, the way you see it, say, in a government document. It's not pure Urdu, the way you'd see it in a Pakistani government document. It is a mix of both. And the one place where it actually survives and survives brilliantly is in Bombay Hindi films. The Bollywood Hindi film industry has kept Hindustani very much in circulation, though we call it Hindi. But if you want to look at the theory of it, it contains both, Urdu, Persian and Sanskrit in equal measure. And so Hindustani survives today, even though Hindustani as a language, the existence of Hindustani as a language is not something that readily occurs to us.
So the other languages that exist in not just in North India, but like in any part of the country where you have this one large standard, this official language of the state, let's say for instance, and then you have a number of other languages along with it. Now, do those languages die eventually, or do you find people speaking both and just they all flourish?
I mean, see, in some cases, for instance, Maithili in Bihar, Maithili is a very old, ancient language. Some of what we call the greatest Hindi literary works are actually written in Maithili. So Maithili survives, and Maithili has become a scheduled language. So the status of Maithili is in some sense safe. And it also demonstrates, Maithili became a scheduled language in I think 2003. It also demonstrates that the greater self-confidence of Hindi, that you have given recognition to a language that you originally wanted to include in yourself. You wanted to say Maithili was a dialect of Hindi, but now you're okay with saying Maithili is a separate language by itself. So, I mean, it all depends on what turn the political events take. Languages could die. A language dies roughly every 3 months. Not in India, world over. So languages are dying at a rapid pace, right? So as we are speaking, a language is dying in a sense. What does it mean when a language dies? People stop speaking it, right? They find no use for it. So I speak language X, but I really don't want my children to speak language X because there's no point, right? He lives in an area where language Y is what is spoken by everyone. Education is in language Y. So why bother with language X? So then when a number of speakers comes below 10,000, the language is officially declared endangered. And then as time passes, the numbers begin to fall. That is the normal observation. So the point is that will languages die? There is every possibility that languages could die. Can languages be kept alive? There is every possibility that languages could be kept alive, but the people have to keep that language alive. It will not just stay alive by itself, especially languages which have only a small number of speakers. Say if you have only 1 lakh speakers, there's a very good chance that over a 30, 40, 50 year period, that 1 lakh could just become 10,000 and then 5,000 and then completely vanish.
So I want to take 3 languages at this point. One is Andamanese, I think it is, where the last speaker died about 10 or 15 years ago. And so that is now officially a dead language. At the same time, you have really ancient languages like the Indus Valley scripts that haven't yet been deciphered.
We don't know which language it is.
It is in a language, but they haven't yet figured out what the language is and what those writings mean. And then you have Prakrit, I think, or Pali, which people didn't know what it meant, what Ashoka's edicts said for a really long time. Until they figured it out. So you have 3 dead languages, really speaking, but all in different stages of deadhood. Because I don't think Andamanese has a script, if I'm
No, Andamanese does not have a script. Andamanese as a distinct family, India's 5th family of languages, was officially recognized only in 2003. And Andamanese is a broad term for about 5 or 6 different languages which were spoken, and Andamanese, and I'm not including Nicobar. Nicobar is separate. So they were spoken by the various tribes in Andamans, for hundreds, thousands of years, in fact. And as in the last 100 or 200 years, they have pretty much vanished. The last speaker of Andamanese, like as he said, died a few years ago. There are people who still know the language. They don't use it as a first language anymore. So there are about 50 speakers still with us who use it as a second or third language. So it was identified as a distinct family just 20 years ago. So there's lots to know about Andamanese, and work is going on, and maybe 5 or 10 years time we will have a greater understanding of Andamanese as a family of languages. But Prakrit, I would say, did not die. Prakrit became the various languages of various Indo-Aryan languages of today. So Marathi goes back to Maharashtri Prakrit, Punjabi goes back to Shauraseni Prakrit. Prakrit is one word, But actually the technically right term would be Prakrits. There are a variety of languages spoken across large parts of northern and western India, all of which have become the modern languages of today. Marathi, Gujarati, Punjabi, Braj, and so on and so forth. So Prakrit is still with us. And what are the other languages you spoke about?
Indus Valley.
That's the great mystery of our times. What language did the Indus Valley civilization speak? And what do those writings mean? There are theories. There is no definite conclusion. So we just have to wait till that mystery is finally solved.
So I want to understand a little bit more about the origins of languages, the family of languages. Like you mentioned, Prakrit has now found expression in so many different ways. Similarly, there's something you call Proto-Dravidian for all the southern languages. And then you have families like Austro-Asiatic and Sino-Tibetan. So what are these families? Where do they come from? And how do they now look?
So when you look at a family of languages today, let's say the Dravidian family of languages, there is a great deal of similarity between them. So scholars then posit that they all emerged from a common source. And that common source is typically given the name Proto-Dravidian, which you can kind of reconstruct when you look at, say, Tamil, Telugu, Malayalam, and Kannada. You'll find many words that are common. And so they kind of figure out that these were the words of that original language. And as people moved away from each other, their languages changed. So Proto-Dravidian is that original source from which Tamil, Telugu, and Kannada emerged. Malayalam emerged from Tamil. So that's why I'm not saying Malayalam. So they emerged from that. So that is the Proto-Dravidian. There is no written evidence of that. It was only a spoken language. It is a theoretical construct which almost definitely existed. So in that sense, it is true.
And there's something you call Northern Brahmi script and Southern Brahmi script. And you draw a connection between the Southern Brahmi with the evidence that Southern Brahmi existed way back. It's connected to...
So there is a Brahmi script which has been found. Ashoka's edicts were all in the Brahmi script. And the Brahmi script was deciphered about 200 years ago. And there is evidence that it began roughly, maybe a little before Ashoka. But there is also some recent evidence that shows, that maybe even 200 years before Ashoka, that script existed. There are traces of it. So Brahmi then broke into two, northern and southern. So the southern language scripts go back to southern Brahmi, and the northern Brahmi scripts are largely the original, from where the scripts of northern India emerged. But if you still see there is a commonality, if you look at southern scripts and northern scripts, Devanagari and say Tamil, for instance, you can actually figure out how they changed over time. Scholars have done it. Because of the writing instruments used, because of the writing material used, the scripts changed over time.
This was essentially if you had to carve it into a stone or if you wrote it on a palm leaf.
On a palm leaf, it just changed.
It allowed you to have cursive writing.
Which is why the southern languages are all very, free-flowing in that sense.
Right, okay, yes.
Now, I want to ask you a question, and we were talking about it. And I think the Andhra-Telangana example proves that. Languages are a great unifier, yes. And I think it was for a long time, it quite worked out. But then it doesn't always work out, isn't it? I mean, and the Andhra Pradesh-Telangana example is something to that effect.
So I want to go back to 47, which is when the whole issue of should we have linguistic states was put on the back burner because of partition. And the idea of an Indian identity was that you were Indian. And if I introduced something else into the mix, the chances of you being Indian were lower because your loyalties would then go elsewhere. So hence the languages were put on the back burner, saying that if you fought for a linguistic state, then you are not supporting India. Or you would want to break away from India, really speaking. And I remember when IPL happened in 2008, and the campaign came about at that time where, a Kolkata fan is trapping a Delhi fan in the lift as a way to get one up and all. And I was reminded of this version of 47, where the fear that if you start becoming sort of provincial and caring about just your area, you would be a detriment to the national interest. And once Andhra was formed, it was found that the opposite was true, that the provincial identity was sort of like this outlet for the Indian to continue to be Indian. And so you had a dual identity that existed, and the Indians needed a dual identity to express. You needed to be able to go to Delhi and say, I'm Tamilian, as much as you going to Europe and saying, I'm Indian. And so that double identity was crucial to to keeping the country together, which I think was counterintuitive when you think about it. But now when you think about it, like, yeah, of course.
Makes perfect sense.
How else can you live?
Hindsight.
You have to be like this. And so Ambedkar had a very, very nice statement about languages and states, where he was a proponent of one language for one state, as opposed to one state for one language, which meant that within a state, it was possibly important and necessary to have an official language. So which means that Andhra can be Telugu. However, you don't have to have one state for Telugu. You can have multiple states for any language. And so the creation of Telangana separately from Andhra, despite the fact that they both speak Telugu and Telangana speaks multiple other languages as well, is possible within the scheme of things and the style of thinking. But also you have to look at the fact that Telangana and Andhra have very different histories. We see Telugu as the one binding factor between the two states, but pre-independence they operated in two separate provinces. Andhra was Madras Presidency, whereas Hyderabad state, what is now Telangana, was under the Nizam and had its own history, spoke 4 different languages. And Hyderabad state was then partitioned into Maharashtra. Part of it went to Maharashtra, part of it came to Karnataka. It's still called Hyderabad Karnataka, although they changed it to Kalyan Karnataka recently. And then part of it came to Andhra. So that dual identity exists. It is supposed to exist. It was supposed to exist in Maharashtra as well, where you had the western part becoming Bombay state, what was Bombay state, and the eastern part being Vidarbha. Both of them speak Marathi. Both of them have very different histories. And Vidarbha was supposed to be a state according to the state's reorganization commission in 56. And then when it was executed, they just decided that they should be one state. And so you had Maharashtra and Vidarbha together, along with Gujarat as well. So it was this massive Gujarat-Maharashtra bilingual state for 4 years, 56 to 60. And
the one concession they gave Vidarbha was a separate Ranji Trophy team, which still exists.
This for me is very interesting. The fact that Ranji Trophy teams are still named Saurashtra, are still named Baroda. Like I think that, I don't know if there's a book that exists on this, but there should be something about why they still carry those names.
Old names, yeah, that's true. Gujarat has 3 Ranji Trophy teams. Gujarat, Saurashtra and Baroda.
Oh yeah, that's right.
Maharashtra has 3 too. Bombay, Maharashtra and Vidarbha.
Yeah. See, this is why it needs a book.
So, shall we open the floor for questions?
Before that, I want to ask you about your research process.
Right.
Because the research for your book sounds impossibly hard. And you've gone back thousands of years to find like origin stories. How did you find this for languages?
I mean, it's if you follow the lead, it's not that difficult. You know, this whole idea of families of languages, that's a good starting point to figure out, to begin the process. Then when you look at families of languages, then you start thinking about, okay, so these are common. These have commonalities. I shouldn't say these are common. So they have a shared history up until some point, at which point in time things diverge. So that's typically how I went about. I looked at families, how many families of languages are there in India. And then, where there are families, there are further divisions, as always, especially in India. So, and then I followed the lead there. So that was where things began. And as you get into the modern history, things become rapidly political, and it's not about languages anymore, or only languages anymore. It's also about power, and it's about other things. So that, in short, was broadly how I did it.
Also, India has thousands of languages. How did you choose 10?
That was the most difficult question. That was the most difficult question. So like I said, again, I followed the family's route. So like I said, India has 5 families: Indo-Aryan, Dravidian, Austroasiatic, and Sino-Tibetan or Tibeto-Burman, and Andamanese. Since Andamanese is is a work in progress, understanding Andamanese is still a work in progress, I decided not to talk about the Andamanese family till we had more information. So I had 4 families of languages to work with. Roughly 75% of India speaks an Indo-Aryan language. So I chose 3 Indo-Aryan languages. Roughly 20% of India speaks a Dravidian languages. So I chose 3 Dravidian languages, 2 from India and 1 Dravidian language from Pakistan. There is a Dravidian language that actually exists in Pakistan still. And then I chose 2 Austroasiatic languages and 2 Tibeto-Burman languages, Sino-Tibetan languages.
And the writing about languages typically tends to be very official in terms or academic in the way it's presented in a book. I think automatically the author just feels like this is a big topic and I have to write it in serious tones and complexities. But your book is very accessible. It's very easy to dive in and pick up, learn about a language in an hour or so. So how, when you approach the writing of this, was this a conscious decision to say I need to make this as accessible as possible?
I need to make it as accessible as possible. I need to include stories, some story around the language, into the discussion of every one of the languages. Because while people do plod through official things, people like to read stories, and that story kind of anchors their, reading a great deal. So that was one thing I tried, and sometimes it was hard to find a good story. But yeah, I managed.
Well, it's something that I did when I was writing as well.
In your case, you actually had to wade through, tons of official documents, because you quote gazetteers and commission reports and, all sorts of other things. That couldn't have been easy.
So there was a lot of writing on each of the states, which surprised me. The other thing that surprised me was I just thought India was linguistic. I thought linguistic was the basis of creation of all states. And it's only when I dived into it that I realized it's only true for about half the states. The rest of it had other reasons for creation. So I looked at a lot of books that were written by other authors, looked at official white papers, government documents, acts. The bills and the acts that are passed in the assemblies are very, very useful. They lay it out in clear language. This is what we are doing. This is what has happened. And so the story that I sought stories for each state, because it just made sense to be able to tell the story of the state in the form of a story. And you get the language, the fancy language from a lot of other places, but you get the meat, the detailing from the government documents. So I just sort of mixed and matched, corroborated a lot of facts as well. I had to do a double check to make sure it's not just somebody who's saying something. And so for that, the government documents were very, very useful.
So before we open the questions, one story which I want you to briefly narrate, the story of Dadra and Nagar Haveli. Very interesting story which not too many people have heard about.
So the Portuguese existed in multiple little pockets on Western India. Largest was Goa, then you had Daman and Diu, and then you had Dadra and Nagar Haveli. And they're all like really little pockets separated by Maharashtra and Gujarat. And so when this whole movement in the early 60s was happening of pushing the Portuguese out, you had multiple satyagrahis entering each of these regions to sort of liberate them from the Portuguese. So Goa was the largest, but then you had Dadra Nagar Haveli. So people would just walk in. On August 15th, a couple of years, satyagrahis just walked into Dadra Nagar Haveli in a bid to try and liberate it. And eventually they did. I mean, you had free Dadra and Nagar Haveli, an actual, it existed for a little bit separate from Goa and Daman and Diu. And free Dadra and Nagar Haveli had to join India. And for it to join India, it needed an official signing authority to say, okay, we are now signing up with India. And so for that reason, there was an IAS officer who was installed as the Prime Minister of free Dadra and Nagar Haveli for a day.
For a day.
He had only one job, which was to sign the document and say we are now part of India. And so yeah, that was and interestingly today, the longest name of an administrative unit in India is Dadra and Nagar Haveli and Daman and Diu. The size is the smallest, but the name is the longest.
And the funny thing is, these satyagrahis, these non-violent satyagrahis following in Gandhi's path, they entered the state and the Portuguese police station or the 10 policemen there, they bolted and ran, even though they had a couple of guns between them. So they were scared of these satyagrahis essentially, isn't it?
It wasn't always like that. I think the first year there was pushback, there was some violence. Or the first year it was non-violent, the second year it was violent. But even in Daman and Diu, they tried to enter and there was a lot of pushback from the Portuguese. Nehru attempted diplomatic negotiations for 14 years. And it was only after he had exhausted everything. He totally believed in diplomacy. It was only after he exhausted everything. And interestingly, it's the African leaders who pushed for the creation of Goa. Because a lot of the African nations were getting independent at that time. And there was an African Congress that happened in Delhi in mid-61. And the African leaders of these newly independent nations, or to be newly independent nations, came up to Nehru and said, Nehru is the leader of the non-aligned movement. India is a huge name in the post-colonial, anti-colonial movement. And they told him, if you are not going to do something about colonialism, if you are not going to push out Portugal,
last remnants,
how can we do anything? So we need you to take the lead for us to be able to do something in Africa. And that was the trigger, the
final push.
Yeah, that was what Nehru needed. And so he had done all the diplomacy. And then he said, okay, fine, we're going to send in the army. We're going to do this by, whatever means.
Yeah, and I think we'd like to answer any questions that you want.
Namaskar. My name is Priyanka. I'm from Assam. I wanted to ask that the languages like Bengali and Assamese, they both have the same script, and their alphabetical order, like Ka, Kha, Ga, Gha, is similar to Kannada alphabetical order Ka, Kha, Ga, Gha. So where is the origin of this similarity? I was just looking at your book and I found out that the Ashokan Brahmi also had the same order of Ka, Kha, Ga, Gha. So that is
okay,
just I got curious.
This is actually very interesting. What scholars say is that India is a distinct language area. So we have these different families of very different languages, but even across families there are similarities, right? So these languages, even though they are one maybe a Dravidian language, another maybe an Indo-Aryan language, they have influenced each other, and one of the influences is the alphabet, and because Indian languages, while they may share a lot, there are a lot of differences, there are a lot of similarities in terms of sounds. And this ordering of the alphabet, suits all kinds of languages in India. And that's why you'll find that commonality across languages.
As someone born in 1948, I have had a kind of a deep
ringside view.
Yeah. First I want to congratulate you on bringing out both these books. I think it's excellent that particularly our English-speaking kids and teenagers will learn something about their own roots and culture, because that's the only language they speak. So, very interestingly, one of the points you brought up was how deep is this feeling of nationhood in a language. And I think in a modern sense, it goes back to 1840s in Kannada, because what is today Karnataka was divided between Hyderabad Nizams, where medium of instruction was Urdu. And the Bombay Presidency, medium of instruction was Marathi. Even in Dharwad. So old Mysore had Kannada. South Canara, which was a part of Ballari, Madras, retained Kannada. So the unification movement had that original people were a guy called Deputy Channabasappa, who insisted that medium of instruction in Bombay Presidency should be
Kannada,
not
Marathi.
So they inspired the next generation of people who are contemporaries of Gandhi or a little older than them in the Congress. For example, Karnad Sadashiv Rao, Kudmul Rangarao, who was older than Gandhi. So all these people were at the core of the unification movement in Karnataka. And the push was really strong, and the resistance, funnily, was mainly in the old Mysore area, because the people felt more loyal to the king, and the bureaucrats felt their seniority would be disturbed if these other bureaucrats come in. There were complex things that I witnessed. And the political one event from that time is amazing. My father was born in 1902. He was 33 years old. Gandhi presided over the Belgaum Congress, where the resolution for unified Karnataka was passed. There were big leaders like Karnad Sadashiv Rao, Gangadhar Rao Deshpande, etc. A 11-year-old girl sung the song, inspirational song of Hulgold Narayan Rao, Udayavagali Namma Chaluva Kannada Nadu. That 11-year-old girl was Gangubai Hangal.
Oh, okay. What a wonderful story that is.
Congratulations again, very interesting presentations. My two related questions. One is about the influence of Indian languages as it spread outside the country, Southeast Asia in particular. And the script, I think it's related to her question. If my understanding is right, the Brahmi script was put together to serve both. Very consciously done, and then it served as the basis for a lot of Southeast Asian writing systems, including Korean and all of that. So could you just shed some light on that?
Yeah. So there's no clear answer about when Brahmi originated, but what little we have of Megasthenes' Indica, he seems to say that there was no script at that point in time. But as the Mauryan Empire became bigger and bigger, there was a need to have written instructions passed throughout the empire, and historians say that that's probably when the script was developed. I mean, it's a story that has been contested by others, but if we broadly think of that, so then that is the original, the meta script of India. And many of the Southeast Asian languages are based on Brahmi, as far as the Philippines. So Philippines, there is a script called the Bebein that is also based on Brahmi. It's not used anymore. The old Javanese script was based on Brahmi, right? Thai, Sinhalese, all based on Brahmi. So Brahmi is actually the first, I don't know, the original Google, or so to speak. And it went out of India.
Hi, thank you for the session. It was so fascinating. My question is, you've spoken about dialects and languages, but what do we call it when a dialect or a language is the same words are spoken with a different intonation or pronunciation in like different parts? For example, in lower Assam Assamese versus upper Assam Assamese, or Malayalam along the coast versus Thiruvananthapuram. So is there something that's different?
No, see, if you talk to a linguist, he will contest the idea of a language itself, right? So there is a small Hindi saying which I used early on in my book, and I want to read that out. कोस कोस पे बदले पानी, चार कोस पर वाणी, पर एक जो नहीं बदलता वो है हिंदुस्तानी. So when you say कोस कोस पर बदले वाणी, कोस is roughly 2 miles. So every 2-4 miles the language changes. The language does not change. The words change, or the pronunciation changes. It's broadly the same language, right? So that being the case, it's normal for, say, a territory which broadly speaks, say, Assamese or whatever language you want to call it, for this point A and this point B, they're actually more or less speaking the same language, but there are differences. It's very normal. If it can happen in a small place like England, right, where every 10 miles or so the English changes, it can definitely happen in a far more complicated, country like India. So they are the same language which have changes. So the thing is, you have a standard, right? And so you have a difference, right? But they're broadly, Now, the good case is if you look at, say, Punjab and Haryana, right? There is a border, but can the Haryanvi villager on that side of the border not understand the Punjabi village or this side of the border? They can understand each other perfectly, right? That Punjabi villager probably won't be understood by the bureaucrat sitting in Chandigarh. But that Punjabi villager and the Haryanvi villager can communicate with each other perfectly. So what do you call that really? Languages are little units. There is a broad unity, but there are differences, and that is the beauty.
So one sec. Yeah, one sec. Do you mind? Yeah, that's okay. Thank you for an interesting conversation and excellent interlocution of each other. So we got a perspective into both the books. And when we were discussing Venkat's book earlier, we talked about the emotional charge that a linguistic identity brings that's so natural, whereas a national identity is something that is, that builds up over time, especially when there's a larger mass and many kingdoms, and over time you create a sense of a national identity with the independence movement, but the linguistic identity is almost like grown with the bone. When you talked about Andhra initially and then Andhra Telangana, splitting into two different states, and sometimes when the splitting of states is done not on a linguistic reason but for political calculation, like Andhra Telangana, that backfired on the Congress when they lost the election immediately in both the states after, and just 10 years later they won Telangana last year. So is that a sense of when you tamper with that linguistic identity and create an artificial division, because there's still people in Andhra who feel that they gave so many seats in every Lok Sabha election to the Congress, second only to UP, and since then they've lost both states. So is there a lesson to be learned for the Congress, among others that they're learning right now in the next
The lesson I can think of is what you need perhaps are great unifiers, not dividers. I think when you have unifying figures, like Gandhi tried to do with Hindustani, when you have unifying figures, they manage to find a middle path.
And again, though the way Telugu is spoken in different parts of states,
I'm sure it's different.
It's different, but it's still, the literature is the same. Similar, and they take pride in each other's, in the Telugu literature, not in Telangana literature and Andhra literature. So
like I'm saying, if you have unifiers, among you who can listen to both and find a solution that more or less satisfies both, that requires both of them to sacrifice a bit, I think that is 75% of the battle won.
And also, is there any sense of a state that was divided like this, then somewhere coming
back together?
Coming back, like for example, Rajnath Singh spoke 2 days back about POK now coming back to India. Do you think that's possible?
Could I take this?
Yeah.
So the Constitution allows for all state borders to be malleable. So is it possible for two states that were initially separated to come back? Yes, it's entirely possible. However, for that to happen, you need the emotional charge, you need the momentum, and circumstances need to be right. The person who's in the government at that point in time, what the on-ground scenario looks like. If you got this perfect storm of everything, then anything is possible, really.
My question is more slightly philosophical to say. You spoke about the dying languages. Even here in this forum, we speak English, though we are patriotic to our own language where we belong to. Where do you see the future of the Indian languages? Is it a dying game, or is it things will exist? Because even my own children, I use it as a code language to speak in Tamil. All right? Otherwise, it's English. So where do you see this going forward, especially when children are following the West more than being centered here?
I have an add-on question. Is Tanglish and Hinglish going to be separate languages going forward?
Okay, I think languages can be revived even when they're on the verge of dying. I don't have examples from India. I have examples from other parts of the world. Welsh has made a sterling comeback, right? 100 years ago, maybe 2-3% of the population spoke or understood Welsh. As per the latest census, roughly 25% of Wales claim some knowledge of the language, right? So it has made a comeback, right? Of course, a lot has gone into it. The state has invested in it and so on. Hebrew, right? Israel brought it back as their language, a language which had been dead for hundreds of thousands of years, in fact. It was only the language, it was like Sanskrit, only the language of ritual and liturgy. It's come back. So even if languages die, languages can come back. And with effort, languages can continue in some way or the other. It depends, And while you might say your children are not speaking your language, maybe 10 years down the line, they'll want to reclaim their linguistic identity and they'll go back and learn that language. That's very much possible. It could happen. And I would like to believe that it will happen. Yeah, so I take a very positive view of what could possibly happen. Absolutely, absolutely. There was this poet called R. Parthasarathi. He spent a number of years in England and he said, language is a tree, loses color under another sky. But then you fight against it, right? You don't go gentle into that good night. You want to retain your language. I lived for a number of years in Punjab. I actually started seriously reading Kannada when I was there. All my years in Bangalore, I didn't bother. It was all around me. I could read it. But there I actually started, and of course Amazon helped. I started buying Kannada books and started reading them because I missed it.
Need for identity very much.
Absolutely.
Yes.
Absolutely.
Just there is already a revival of younger generations wanting to speak Hindi, Punjabi, Gujarati. Even 10, 15 years back, the youngsters did not speak anything other than English. Thank you. But now, hopefully, I see in my old age, the younger generation is interested. My daughter is in the corporate head. She sees, Mama, I see people who spoke only English now, the younger people are wanting to speak in Hindi. You connect better when you speak in your own language. That's what
and social media has played an important role in enabling this.
Thank you. Thank you.
The internet has helped spread, for instance, an app like Duolingo, through which you can teach yourself languages. So stuff like that really helps.
Just a technical question. You said something about the root of the Dravidian languages. I remember my grandfather talking about a language called Grantham.
Grantha is a script.
Is it a script?
It's a script.
Oh, and is that what you refer to as something, you said something Dravid?
No. Grantha is only a script. Grantha was used to write Malayalam, Tamil and Sanskrit.
Yeah, I remember it used to be on palm leaves.
Yeah. So I found out this only a few days ago. My grandfather's brother, he knew only Grantha. He did not know any other script. He used to read only Grantha. Yeah, he used to read the Sanskrit shlokas in Grantha. He didn't know any other script.
What's the language name you said in Tripura before the...
Kokborok.
So I have a sort of a three-part over here, sorry. So I have a three-part question. So you talked about evolving identities in this country, right? So English has been around for about 400 years. Now some of us, think everything in English. So you didn't address about the English as an Indian language, one. The other thing is, see, for India was about, for 800 years, a Persophonic country for a large part of it. We used to speak Persian. But we have moved away from it. But still in pockets, like in Punjab, you said, older generations still understand, read in Persian. Okay. So similarly, now in India, a lot of us, as I said, the other part is, see, if you think about it, Persian, Hindi, they're all Indic languages, ultimately. No, Indo-European languages, even English. So it's not really a foreign language for that matter, right?
I agree with you. In my opinion, English is an Indian language now. I completely agree with you. No, and the fact that we have Hinglish or Tanglish means we have made it our own and we are using it in inventive ways. And so it is an Indian language in my opinion. Absolutely. We are contributing a lot of words. Excellent words. Okay. Last two questions.
Yeah. Yeah, hi Karthik, hi Venkat. So Karthik, my question to you is, I want to know your opinion about the stigma associated with the dialects or accents in the local vernacular languages. For example, a person speaking Bundelkhandi or Bhojpuri would be considered inferior to the person speaking standard Hindi. On the other hand, a person speaking Malwa, Punjabi would be considered inferior, considered rural, rustic as compared to person speaking the standard Punjabi, right? So that is my question. My question is, what's your opinion on this? Where are we going towards? And I'm sorry, I have another question to Venkat as well. What is your opinion about, not opinion, but where do you see the stateless languages going towards? For example, you have Gondi. It's spread across 4 states, that is Maharashtra, MP, Chhattisgarh, and even Andhra Pradesh as well. On the other hand, you have Sindhi as well, although they belong to a very prosperous community, and they have been successful in getting it recognized as a scheduled language. But on the other hand, Gondi lacks that, Gondi people, the people who speak Gondi lacks that, what do you call it, that advantage, the capital advantage, we might say, as compared to Sindhi people. So where do you see the stateless languages going towards? Thank you very much.
See, like for instance, I think if people come together and own a language, right, I think it can go the right way, right? Sindhi being a good example. Sindhi doesn't have a territory in India. Sindhis are found all across the country, and they managed to come together to give Sindhi scheduled language status, and that happened in 1967. So languages like Gondi, for instance, the possibility exists. People need to mobilize. You have to put pressure. You have to create resources in your own language. The challenges are many. It's not easy. And I mean, Gondi as a language actually is heading towards endangered status, because there are roughly 10 million Gonds, but roughly 3 million of them speak Gondi at this point. So 7 million are speaking other languages, right? Maybe they have some knowledge of Gondi, but they are not recognizing it as their mother tongue. So I mean, where it will go depends on where the people want to take it. That's all I would say. And this business about rusticity and looking down upon them, that's just the arrogance of the educated. I mean, there's nothing else to say about it. It's wrong. It's terrible. Because there is actually no basis for it. Like I said, a standard language is very arbitrary. Malwa Punjabi could have been the standard language, or Bundelkhandi could have been the standard language in an alternate universe where Bundelkhand was the capital of, say, the Mughal Empire, for instance. So that could have easily happened. It didn't happen, and so certain other things happened. That's all there is to it.
I'd like to take the example of 3 languages to illustrate the differences of what you're saying. One is Kodavatak, the Kodugu language. It is part of a district. So it's not a state language, but it is spoken in that district by the people of that community. Then you have the Irula language, which is in Tamil Nadu, which isn't exactly Tamil. It is different from Tamil, but it is very specific to that community, that tribe that speaks that language. And then you have Tulu, which is a language that is spoken across the coast. You can find it pretty much anywhere. It's not located in a district like Kodagu, or it's not located in a tribe like Irula. So what I'm coming to is that even if the language is stateless, and stateless really means it doesn't have territory, if it has a thriving community, business, arts, culture, if the language is used in day-to-day creation and conversation, then the language will thrive, will survive. It doesn't need physical space for it to exist in its radiance, in its glory.
No, look what a movie like Kantara has done. It has brought the culture of that region and that language to a lesser extent into focus. It's brought it to our attention. So moves like that, give us hope.
So what's your view on the languages being taught in school being brought down to 2 from 3? Earlier it was 3 languages, now 2. And going ahead it would be English by default as one and other local or Hindi as an option. And the long-term repercussions of this for the survival of language.
Yeah, it is actually a very serious issue. It is an issue that educationists have spoken about education in the mother tongue, but at the same time there are the pressures of the market. So we see all these forces acting out, playing out, and that's just the way it is. And we have to figure out, even though the schools are not teaching the language, how then can we continue to keep the language alive? We have to seek answers to those questions. There is no solution. We have to find and invent solutions. And I think we can invent solutions in this technological age. That is one thing I'm putting my money on.
And is the medium of instruction in local languages or Hindi dying down an inevitable thing?
There is a huge demand for English that is
entire medium for all other subjects.
Yeah. I mean, Andhra has stopped teaching in the local language, right? They want to make it English. And it's a function of the market. When you learn English, you get good jobs. If you learn Telugu or whatever, you don't get good jobs. That is the thinking. Whether or not it's true is a different matter. That is the thinking. And our higher education is in English, right? If you want to study engineering, you have to study it in English. You can't study it in Telugu or Tamil or whatever. So those are the market pressures on the language. And the language has to find ways to be able to deal with that. So there are no solutions. There are possibilities, there are imaginations, there are no clear-cut solutions.
That said, I want to highlight that if we go to the markets of any city, the level of migration that exists in the country is so high that I have, opposite my house, there's a Rajasthani shopkeeper who speaks perfect Kannada, and he's learnt it after coming here. And all the boys in his shop have learnt, they're sitting with Kannada notebooks and learning the language while they're doing their day-to-day business. So I think the high level of migration that exists, even though officially in schools, in education, it's not being taught, there's a pressure of the market where they come and it's the practicality. I have to learn the language to survive here. And suddenly you're getting trilingual, quadrilingual speakers from the north speaking southern languages. And I guess that's the reality
That's the reality of the market again.
That was really wonderful. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you to Karthik and Venkat for bringing today's session to BIC. And thank you to the audience for your time, interest, and questions. The books are available for purchase and signing outside. Thank you and have a good night.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Questions were wonderful.